All right, welcome to another program here. Now, June 27th, 1848, 3 men were murdered right here. They're buried right here, and that gave a name to the spring right here, Tragedy Springs. The story goes that they were murdered by Indians. Well, we're going to look at the context here a minute. Play around. Maybe you enjoyed Sherlock Holmes stories or Columbo movies. Let's examine this a minute. These 3 men, Mr. Cox, Mr. Allen, and Mr. Browett, were coming up in advance of the Mormon Emigrant Party. Now, the Mormon battalion had been guided into California to fight in the California-Mexican War by, of all things, Sacagawea's son. They'd come in by way of Southern California, and some of those men, after the war, had ended up working for James Marshall down in Coloma. The Indians really thought highly of them because they actually, in their process coming out here, they helped a lot of Indian tribes, especially those who were being attacked by the Mexicans and by Californios on numerous occasions. Now, these 3 men were to guide the route. Kit Carson had already done this route, and so they just had to follow it up, make sure they were pulling hand carts. They didn't have horses or anything. Now, these men were killed here. When the main party discovered them, there was no evidence of a struggle. And the bodies were buried right here beside the spring, and there were some broken arrows laying around. Discarded broken arrows. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. The 3 men are buried, and Mr. Allen's pouch of gold that he had dug while down at Coloma was still on him. Now, here's what you have to take into account. This is the Washoe people's homeland. You're 30 miles inside the nearest boundary, probably closer to 40 miles actually at this point, as the Washoe or Washishu people dominated this area. This is their homeland. They didn't bury their dead. The Hill Nisenan, which would be off to that way, the Moklelos, Yaknemas, what we call today's Miwok, none of them buried their dead. Because the grizzly bears would dig up the dead and drag them around, they cremated the dead. If they had murdered these men, they wouldn't have buried them. It would be as alien to them because of their religion and their practices. Why bury the men? Now, if it had been somebody else, and looking around here, you can do it for yourself. There's boulders, there's rock piles, there's any number of places you could drag the body off and stuff it up behind some rock and throw some brush on it, and nobody would find it. These 3 men were buried 2-3 steps from the spring, where they're absolutely certain to be found. There's no way you can miss them. None. If it had been a Californio, if it had been a Mexican, if it had been an American desperado that murdered these 3 men, would he have left the gold? I mean, honestly, no. They would not leave the gold. If it had been any number of outlaws, you're not going to leave the man's gold on him. And if you're an Indian, Washishu, Hill Nisenan, Siaknama, Maklelo, you didn't even have a gun. June of 1848, none of the Washoe had a gun, not even a gun. The Hill Nisenan did not have, in June of 1848, a single gun. Yet these men were shot. But there's broken arrows laying around. The tribesmen would have recycled the arrows, the fletching, the arrowhead. This makes no sense. So let's run down the list of suspects. If it's not an American, trapper, miner, whatever that killed him because they left the gold on him, it's not a Mexican that did it. He wouldn't have left the gold on him. Let alone, none of those would have had any business going to the effort to dig a grave to cover the men up so they're certain to be found. And it's not Native Americans who don't own a shovel. That's one of the things that just wasn't a big trade item for the Washoe or the Hill Nisenan or the McClellos. A shovel? You try digging in this ground and you tell me how much work you're going to do. To coin old Clint Eastwood from the movie Two Mules for Sister Sarah, I don't mind shooting them for you, sister, but I ain't going to sweat over them for you. And they didn't take the gold. So if you break this down, it's pretty obvious it's not the Indians that killed him. Now, it has to be brought in. Why were they going this way? Brigham Young had a pipe dream about having the greater Mormon empire of Deseret go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The discovery of gold and the gold rush, which was just starting, when he got word of that, that dream evaporated. He sent word for the Mormon people living at Coloma and out in California, and there's another outfit that was out here in the Carson Valley. Pack it up, head to Salt Lake City, head back to Utah. They were going there. Later, this culminates in a lot of strange things that happened with the Mormons at that moment in time. It wouldn't be too many years later, you have the Mountain Meadows Massacre, where innocent women and children, infants, are murdered by Mormon forces. They're lured out, told that they could surrender peacefully. They'd been surrounded and attacked, and then they're summarily executed. And that was covered up. You also had many Mormons that tried to leave during what's called the Anglo-Mormon War or Buchanan's Blunder, and they were massacred on about the Utah-Nevada line trying to get out of Utah. Who would have the reason that these men would not have put up a fight, would not have put up any resistance, been murdered, but then carefully buried so that the scavengers, the birds, and everything wouldn't deface them, such that it was easy for the people when they arrived here to identify Allen and make sure that his widow back in Iowa would get his gold, that they would know exactly who it was that had died. You think on it like you would if you watched a Columbo picture or read a Sherlock Holmes novel, and you can draw a pretty accurate conclusion as to who actually murdered these three men on June 27th of 1848.